In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice: compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact.
So if you want to relate politics into boxing terms or into UFC terms, today in Davos, we witnessed the co-headliner, Mark Carney, showing up in front of a crowd in Davos to talk about what's happening from his perspective with Greenland, the USA, NATO. Tomorrow is the headliner, the show, the one that everyone wants to watch, is going to be Donald J. Trump. He's speaking in Davos tomorrow. But today was a very fascinating moment. It was a very fascinating situation that we're seeing unravel or happen before our very eyes. We've talked about it on today's live stream. We're seeing the fact that this battle is happening between NATO, Trump, and therefore China. Right now, it's really a battle between the US and China. NATO is upset because Trump has realized that NATO doesn't provide a whole lot of value outside of what the US brings to the table. So he's saying, why are we a part of you guys? Why do you guys get a say if you guys don't bring much? I just had to call you guys out to meet your NATO targets in terms of what your defense spending is this past year. What do you do? NATO's not been too happy. And Trump has now been saying, all right, we're going to work around you guys, and US is going to work on their terms, and we're going to secure our borders. We're going to secure our hemisphere, and we're going to make sure we defend ourselves from the likes of China. NATO has not taken too kindly to this. They have essentially lost their bodyguard from their midst, and that they can't control anymore. This is worrisome to them because now they have to figure out what they're going to do. So Mark Carney gets up in Davos today to give his speech, and that speech was scathing. It was diplomatic. It was calm. However, if you read between the lines, Mark Carney, on behalf of NATO, declared war on Donald Trump. And that could spell something very spooky, but also fascinating with what happens. And we're going to be talking about all that in this episode today. So, should be wild, but welcome to the Elevate Podcast. I'm your host, Josh. If you're getting value from today's episode, take the time to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us to grow. It helps us to get to new audiences. It helps people see that there is something different than what the mainstream media has to offer. And now let's get our first story, shall we? Before we get into all that I just discussed, this was fascinating, right? If you joined me on my live stream this morning, we went through this article together. This from the Globe and Mail, military models Canadian response to hypothetical American invasion. And again, people, like I said, people will headline read and they push this story into the ether where people only read the headline, they'll never read the byline, or won't even read the article, where they reiterate in the article 2 or 3 different times saying, this is actually never going to happen. Trump will likely never invade Canada, but this is what we're doing. It was such a bunk story on so many levels. Well, Sam Cooper, investigative journalist, tweeted about this today, and based on his connections in the military. And this is what he wrote today. He says, inbox from a real Canadian military official with a global awareness called the Globe story laughable, suggesting it's LPC propaganda, Liberal Party of Canada propaganda. I said what I said. I was giving it more credence than it even needed to. I said the headline is a joke, but it is fascinating throughout the article saying, no, this is probably never going to happen, likely never happen, but hey, they are looking into what it could happen. And then to hear that from Sam Cooper sources, it's like, that didn't happen. This seems like something that was fed to them by the government. But let's jump into Mark Carney, shall we? So the fascinating thing about Mark Carney is we've talked about it here is we've seen all the bills they've introduced here in Canada, all the bills that are very focused on centralizing authority, all the bills that are focused on censorship, all the bills that are focused on controlling what you do, say, or think. He managed to start off his speech today referring to a story, using a story as an example of how things are going right now between NATO and Donald J. Trump, and uses a story that was borrowed from a recount of how the communists kept power for so long. Listen to how he starts this off.
The Czech dissident Václav Havel, later president, wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless. And in it, he asked a simple question: how did the communist system sustain itself? And his answer began with the greengrocer. Every morning, this shopkeeper places a sign in his window, "Workers of the world unite." He doesn't believe it. No one does. But he places the sign anyway to avoid trouble, to signal compliance, to get along. And because every shopkeeper on every street does the same, the system persists. Not through violence alone, but through the participation of ordinary people in rituals they privately know to be false. Havel called this living within a lie. The system's power comes not from its truth, but from everyone's willingness to perform as if it were true. And its fragility comes from the same source. When even one person stops performing, when the greengrocer removes his sign, the illusion begins to crack. Friends, it is time for companies and countries to take their signs down.
There's a lot to even mention there. There's a lot I could even say about it. You know, one thing being that's how he runs his government here in Canada is the illusion that everything's good. Canada's doing great. Look at all of our jobs. Okay. Look at all the success we were having. Look at all the deals we're doing. Canada's doing awesome. And if you disagree with that notion, you're a bad Canadian. You know, it's funny how Canadians have been taking their signs down for a long time if we're going to use that example. And his government, his party, really don't like people like us. Hilarious that he uses that story as an example about how companies and countries need to respond to the likes of the United States. We can't keep pretending anymore is the theme throughout this speech, that everything is fair with the United States. Everything is fair with how this was all working out. And you might sit there and think, Josh, you're making conclusions. No. I'm going to show you clips throughout this. That's exactly what he's referring to throughout this speech. And it was almost comical that he decided to use that example as why people need to stop believing in Donald Trump, stop believing what the United States is doing, and we need to start forming our own future. Okay? And I'll show you what I mean. A minute and a half after this, he talks about how middle powers need to come together and realize this relationship that they've had with the larger power, the hegemony of the United States, it's Fugazi. This relationship was Fugazi. And listen to this.
And we knew that international law applied with varying rigor depending on the identity of the accused or the victim. This fiction was useful. And American hegemony in particular helped provide public goods, open sea lanes, a stable financial system, collective security, and support for frameworks for resolving disputes. So we placed the sign in the window. We participated in the rituals. And we largely avoided calling out the gaps between rhetoric and reality. This bargain no longer works. Let me be direct. We are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination. The multilateral institutions on which the middle powers have relied, the WTO, the UN, the COP, the architecture, the very architecture of collective problem solving are under threat. And as a result, many countries are drawing the same conclusions, that they must develop greater strategic autonomy in energy, food, critical minerals, in finance and supply chains. And this impulse is understandable. A country that can't feed itself, fuel itself, or defend itself has few options. When the rules no longer protect you, you must protect yourself.
It doesn't work anymore. And you hear the classic Mark Carney terminology that he used in Canada or has used in Canada to stimulate fear among our people. This isn't a transition, it's a rupture. Things are changing. We can't trust it anymore. Look at how they're leveraging their power against us. We can't stand for this. We must move elsewhere. This is the theme throughout his whole speech, that the middle powers, pretty much all of NATO, are saying we need to move elsewhere. This whole idea that it just kind of worked out with the United States, it doesn't work anymore. Can't do it. We have to figure out a different path. And it's fascinating because Emmanuel Macron decided to wear his sunglasses at night. He hopped on the stage earlier in the day to discuss a wide variety of issues, but he made a serious point that we need to see more Chinese-specific investment into Europe. Not just random Chinese crap, just really targeted Chinese investment into Europe. Listen to this.
China is welcome, but what we need is more Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe in some key sectors to contribute to our growth, to transfer some technologies, and not just to export towards Europe some devices or products which sometimes don't have the same standards or are much more subsidized as the one being produced in Europe.
We want to work with China more strategically. We don't just want to import stuff that has that just displaces our people. He tries to be careful there. But he says we want their intel. We want what they're doing. Very similar to the article that was published a couple days ago here in Canada, where Canada is looking to be the first in North America to build an EV with Chinese intelligence. And we watched it on our live stream this morning, where Keir Starmer has built the largest Chinese embassy in Europe, based in London. And Macron gets up saying, we need more Chinese investment. Mark Carney's going to go through this speech. Middle powers saying, we got to rely on ourselves. No. The middle powers are teaming up to go to another daddy. And his name is Xi Jinping. Middle powers can't operate without a superpower. And no matter what Carney says during this address, which he has said already, what we've seen, and he's going to hit that even harder as we watch more. The fight is very real. As we read or watch more of what Mark Carney says, don't get it twisted. This was a shot across the bow to the U.S. and Donald Trump, saying NATO is not going to tolerate any more of this. We will stand up to you. We're going to run to daddy China. Sorry, we're going to do it. Even though he says throughout, oh, no, we're going to rely on ourselves. No. You're not going to rely on yourself. You're going to China. That's literally how you survive, because you have not done your work, done your job to have true sovereignty in your own nation. You've had to rely on somebody else constantly, and you haven't developed your own resources. You haven't developed your own projects. You just prayed that Daddy USA would be there to help no matter what, and you got lazy. But here it was, Howard Lutnick, member of the United States administration, talking about this very issue of Europe relying more on China and living in a fictitious world.
Of thinking. It is completely different than the WEF. I viewed the WEF as not a flagpole in the middle, but in fact, they are the flag. Whichever way the wind blew, so it blew. You should have solar, you should have wind. Why are you going to do solar and wind? Why would Europe agree to be net zero in 2030 when they don't make a battery? They don't make a battery. So if they go 2030, they are deciding to be subservient to China, who makes the batteries. Why would you do that? Why would the United States of America, which has oil and natural gas, try to convert to all electricity? China does not have oil and natural gas. Electricity and electric cars make perfect sense to them. That is practical and logical.
He's saying it there. You guys went on this whole green journey. Where are you getting your batteries from? You're essentially subservient to China. It was said even earlier in the day by Scott Bessent that Europe still relies and buys stuff from Russia in the midst of this whole war. This war they've been, fighting Russia on and talking how Russia's so bad, and they keep buying energy from them. He says here.
We have Europe buying Russian oil still, 4 years later, they are financing the war against themselves. India started buying Russian oil after the conflict began, but President Trump put a 25% tariff on them, and India has geared down and has stopped buying Russian oil. And then three, China is a very large buyer of Russian oil, as they are of Iranian oil, as they were of Venezuelan oil. But guess what, Maria? No more Venezuelan oil for them.
So where are they getting their energy from? What are you going to do? Either you do stuff yourself, or you're going to have to rely on somebody. In this case, Europe's been relying on Russia. You could rely on the U.S., but no, we got to prove something to you. And then, and obviously that was before Trump and the tariffs. This was during the Biden administration when that war took place. And we know the story. We know what they've been doing. We know what's been going on. We go back to Mark Carney, though, in his address. He later on says that he agrees with Donald Trump. He agrees with the United States that something needs to be done in terms of securing the security of Greenland, but there's another way we need to deal with it. There's got to be another way. There's not a way we can do it like this. This is not the way. How? How is it going to be, Mark Carney? How is it going to be done? NATO hasn't done their job of securing their military and keeping up with their military spending. So who's going to do it? We end up talking about how NATO needs to band together. And this is like this 1 minute that tells you this was the moment where I was like, oh shoot, this is it, man. NATO, this is the shot across the bow. They're using Mark Carney as the conduit to send this message to Donald Trump on a global stage. This is getting messy. And listen to this.
But I'd also say that great powers can afford for now to go it alone. They have the market size, the military capacity, and the leverage to dictate terms. Middle powers do not. But when we only negotiate bilaterally with a hegemon, we negotiate from weakness. We accept what's offered. We compete with each other to be the most accommodating. This is not sovereignty. It's the performance of sovereignty while accepting subordination. In a world of great power rivalry, the countries in between have a choice: compete with each other for favor, or to combine to create a third path with impact. We shouldn't allow the rise of hard power to blind us to the fact that the power of legitimacy, integrity, and rules will remain strong if we choose to wield them together. Which brings me back to Havel.
There it is. We band together, we can wield the power together to make sure rules and stability stand strong. Again, if you read between the lines, that's what that message is. NATO is going to fight back against the U.S., and they are going to win. That is the message that Mark Carney is sending in this speech. And that, my friends, is very concerning. As I said, right now it's Donald Trump versus everybody. U.S. versus China, U.S. versus NATO, and NATO is now running to China to get legitimacy, claiming that we're going to bring it together. We're going to wield this power together. We're going to wield it together as we all start running to China to get deals done. China, please come invest in Europe. China, please come invest in Canada. It's just they're substituting one superpower for another because they don't have legitimacy unless they have a superpower behind them. It's just, that's how geopolitics works, folks. And this is why I want to bring it back to this. So there's one last thing. He was asked a question at the end of this. And he was asked about globalism, which is that will get all the headlines. I'm not going to address that right now because it was funny, but we'll post on our socials and stuff. That was fascinating. But it was more so his question about the Arctic. How comfortable and confident are you in securing the Arctic against the likes of Russia and China? Do you believe those are your enemies? Do you believe they are our enemies? And Mark Carney's answer was very telling.
And when President Trump says, Greenland's under threat from Russia, even from China, is that for real?
I would say that there are threat. Russia is without question a threat in the Arctic, without question. Russia does lots of horrible things, and I'll take the opportunity to condemn their unjustified and horrific assault on Ukraine, almost at its fourth year. They are a real threat in the Arctic, one against we need to protect, which is why we have 364 5-day air, sea, and land presence. It's why we're adding to our submarine fleet, adding to our air fighter fleet, why we're building out over-the-horizon radar to protect from Russian missile threats and others, and why we will work with our NATO partners. The threat is more perspective than actual at this stage in terms of actual activity in the Arctic, and we intend to keep it that way.
You hear that? China, are they a real threat? Pauses. I don't know. Russia's definitely a threat. Russia is definitely a threat. I will condemn Russia all day and night. Won't say a dang thing about China. That's telling. That's telling. China is a legitimate threat, but because NATO's so upset with Donald Trump doing what he's doing, they're running to China, so now they cannot criticize China publicly. He doesn't view China as a threat. Oh, it's just a thought. It's a theory at this point. Okay. You're telling me all the business activity that's been happening in Greenland and China launching boats and having activity in the Arctic. Oh, yeah. It's more perspective at this point. Speculative. Okay. That's Mark Carney, folks. That is day 2, technically, of Davos and the World Economic Forum. That was Carney's speech today, speaking on behalf of NATO and how they need to fight back against the United States, and they will. And they will. Donald Trump takes the stage tomorrow. We'll see what his response is and what he has to say. As we saw Howard Lutnick and Stephen Bissett, had their say today as well. Tomorrow's going to be interesting, folks. Tomorrow's going to be interesting. Anyways, as for me, I'm out.